for everyone for bearing with us for a few moments. 6 minutes in. Okay, well, we'll have to go 6 minutes over time from all that. So look, it's pretty obvious that AI is the topic of the day. I think that's pretty natural that whenever you are at the cusp of something which you know is going to be big, but no one knows yet what it is, it's a bit like going to those, rock concerts when you're a teenager and you think this is going to be the greatest night of my entire life. You haven't yet seen it play out, so you don't really know whether that's the truth. And I think AI is like that. Everyone is imagining what the future is going to look like, and no one really knows. So it's an opportunity for lots of different voices to come in and lots of different perspectives and things that we should be worried about and attempt to try to learn from past and all that sort of thing, which is what a lot of the dialogue that we're trying to think about for ESA for not much less of this year, but certainly for next year as well. So we were particularly keen that we've got Ben coming along who's thought a lot about these issues from different perspectives from the one that at least I bring out it from there. And I think that's a terrific thing to do. Ben's with me at Macquarie University and associate professor there. And he works on a bunch of different things, housing and urban design. And he's the co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab. The lab bit, I guess, means that we haven't quite worked out exactly what's going to do, but close enough from all of that. And so you can already get a pretty good indication of where he thinks it's going to go in this topic from here. Thought a lot about what would be the case for that, where going, and how that links into the current environment with AI. So with that, I will just pass over to Ben. Ben's mandate has been to be as controversial as he possibly can be. And he's really, really good at that from there. So I think it's going to be a really exciting part. Thank you, Ben, for being here. And also to everyone for waiting as we set up. Okay, the floor's yours.
Thanks very much, David. Can everyone online hear me and see what they need to say?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Ben.
Wonderful. So thanks very much for the introduction. And so I come from Macquarie, from the Australian Basic Income Lab and other things. And I think I got asked along here to do this because of this conversation piece, which I was actually asked to write from the Basic Income Lab about what would happen to essentially to money if AI does mean that if the positive predictions are right, and basically you can just produce endless amounts of everything, but no one necessarily has jobs. I'm not going to quite go into that big hypothetical stuff, but I am going to try and think through some of what's going on with AI in a way that is a little bit provocative, which means I'm going to be a little bit high level and big picture and thinking about what AI means in a kind of longer, bigger setting. And I really do welcome people pushing back on that, so please do. I want to begin by acknowledging the country we're meeting on here, Gadigal land, where I also live, but also the Darug land on which we work at Macquarie, and the land that everybody who's joining us online is also coming from, and pay respects to traditional owners, past, present, and emerging. I also wanted to briefly pay tribute to Russell Ross, who I had the honour of going along to his memorial a little while ago, and Russell was, I know, secretary to the General Committee here for a long time, under many presidents. He was also coordinating the PhD program in economics when I was a PhD student at Sydney, and I did political economy, and political economy and economics had the same doctoral program at that stage. They don't anymore. But I also know his son, Leo, who's a fierce advocate for tenants' rights, and so I wanted to, being in this space, to acknowledge him as well. So we have wildly different predictions of what AI is going to do. This comes from the Dallas Fed Reserve. People might have seen it. Let's see if I can move this, just hide. There you go, that's better. This comes just recently from the Fed Reserve of Dallas, where they're partly poking fun a little bit at what AI is going to do. So it has three scenarios there charted. One where we get a tech singularity and we end scarcity. Another where we lead to human extinction through the same tech singularity. And the other, which is that AI increases growth by 2.1% for 10 years before reverting back to the mean, which is a central prediction there, which, as you can see, in a long time horizon looks like. So something like that in between those is going to happen. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the upside, but probably closer to the middle part than anything else. And I'm going to make some claims that this is basically where I'm going to go. So first, I'm going to suggest that many of the economic elements of what we might call abundance have already been brought into existence. We already have them now. It doesn't feel like that because the social consequences of abundance have. So we have lots of stuff, but we haven't worked out how to make that a reality for everybody. So how we translate economic organisation into social outcomes, I'm going to suggest is actually much more important than the economic organisation itself. And you can see somewhere where I'm going with AI. And from that perspective, I'm going to suggest if this question of how you get from economic organisation to social outcomes is the main thing you're focusing on, AI doesn't really look like a disruptor. It actually looks like a follower. It looks like it is reproducing the existing norms and relationships we have and is being shaped by them. It's not shaping them. That's what I'm going to suggest. And as I say, agree to, looking forward to the discussion. So I've got 3 questions that I'm organising that around, partly because Russell was a Labor economist. I thought I'd start with the question of labour. Then I'm going to look at the question of price or the question of money. And then finally, a question of capital as a way of trying to think through AI from this sort of economic and distributive, how do we organise the productive system question. So this question, this idea that technology is going to lead us to be able to produce a lot more, much more effectively, is not a new question, right? This has been going on for ages. This is Keynes' economic possibilities for our grandchildren, which is almost 100 years old, will be, I think, next decade, where he makes fairly similar predictions without there being anything that looks like AI, right? That is just looking at how economic growth works, the confounding effects of economic growth. He predicts that his grandchildren won't have to work more than 15 hours a week because there'll just be so much stuff. How could we possibly still be working that long? And that's actually relatively, like the growth that he talks about has materialized. That his predictions of productive capacity are broadly true from his prediction 90 years ago. And one of the places where I think it's easiest to think this through, where it's reasonably concrete, we can talk about real things, we don't talk about money, is the food economy. Because I think it's actually pretty hard to argue that Australia doesn't have food abundance now. But we also have 1 in 8 Australians who are food insecure. That is, that they aren't confidently able to secure, to know they're going to get the food and access the food they need every day. Like, that's an astonishing figure. We also have, and these are Australian government figures, 312 kilograms of food waste per person per year. So we've got all the food we need, and more than 10% of the population can't access it. There's lots of reasons you might not be able to access food, but that figure is based overwhelmingly on people who cannot afford it. That is, the reason that they are denied food is they do not have the money to pay for the food that they want. So producing abundance doesn't lead to an end of scarcity, at least under the way we currently organise our economy. The rest of the economy is a lot more complicated. Food, I think, is relatively concrete. So that's the I suppose the background question that I'm thinking this through. And the first of those 3 questions I was going to ask is the one on labour. And as David said, I do things in a bunch of different spaces. And one of the most interesting parts of being like really in the middle of different kinds of economic conversations is that often they have different assumptions and even contradictory assumptions. So we know that at the heart of this conversation is an argument that we're going to run out of jobs. Yep, AI basically means we won't have enough jobs for everybody. This is one of many different predictions on the decline of jobs. This is in America, but I took it from an article that was applying it to Australia. There's heaps of them. The broad outline is all I want, that there aren't enough jobs. I spent most of, well, a large chunk of the 2010s in a different debate. It was a debate about population aging, which took it as completely axiomatic that we were going to run out of workers. That one of the primary problems that the Australian economy faced was we had an aging population, we wouldn't have any workers. And these two questions are held together in our economic debate quite a lot. We won't have enough jobs and we won't have enough workers. So something weird is going on for that to be the case. So if we look over a long period of time on how jobs have changed, we find a couple of things. This is from a book I published a year or two ago about the welfare state and inequality. And I kind of reorganized ABS data a little bit. That top line is just the services in the economy that aren't categorized anywhere else. You can see that's been relatively stable. The service economy we're talking about is not all services. So those arrows don't quite align, do they? That top one is all of the employment in industries that we might associate with the production of physical goods. So they're agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, utilities, and as is probably unsurprising to everyone here, it's in long-term decline, has been at least since the 1950s and 60s. The next line, that blue one that's going up, is essentially the services of the welfare state. And they have been in steady rise, particularly around healthcare services, now for quite a long period of time. So when we talk about the rise of the service economy, actually we're really talking about the rise of the care economy. There is a rise in professional technical services, which is the dark blue line. And the other line is the finance, real estate industries, which have been taking a larger and larger share of profits, but have not been occupying a larger share of people's jobs. Yep. So as an employment question, the economy has shifted increasingly over the last couple of hundred years from one that produces physical things to one that is mainly engaged in social reproduction, you might say, in the care economy and the welfare state. And that trend has, if anything, taken off more, particularly since the global financial crisis and since COVID, and has particularly taken off in Australia. So this is recent RBA data, the ones over here. Also took that from macro business. So there is a structural shift in employment towards the industries that we associate with our reproducing people. And I would say also in terms of the broader questions of investment we'll get to later on, ecology as well. It's a big shift in the way that the economy is organised. And if you think about what AI is likely to do, sure, it is going to impact the care economy, but it's very likely to exaggerate those trends. That is, it's going to exaggerate forms of automation. It is essentially a form of automation. The moment if you go and talk to philosophers and say, what do you think of artificial intelligence? Well, they'd say, well, our main problem is it's not artificial and it's not intelligence. Large language models are very sophisticated forms of automation, but they follow the same logics as automation. So we'd expect it to speed up exactly these processes. So there's, in terms of the question of labour, I'm going to suggest that there's not a good reason to think that AI is going to mark a break from those trends as much as the implementation of them. But that helps draw to our attention there is a really big thing going on in the organisation of at least what we call work, where work is increasingly associated with things that actually most people don't think is the economy at all. And that when we talk about AI, we think about physical production, which is associated with the economy, which increasingly is not the main game of the thing we call jobs. The categories don't all align properly. So moving on to this question of price or money or value. So the economy has grown dramatically as Keynes anticipated. Working hours have not declined as he anticipated. In fact, they've basically flatlined since the 1970s. The size of government has grown even more rapidly than the economy. From Keynes's perspective, I think Keynes would be genuinely astonished that any country in the world could have the public sector be over 30% of GDP. And that's fairly typical of many OECD countries now. And obviously, as a proportion of GDP, that means the state is growing even more rapidly than the economy is. And maybe this is slightly provocative, I don't know, with this audience. I'm going to suggest the government plays actually a much more central role in determining prices across the economy. It's not just what we call public spending or taxation. The government now plays a central role in how prices are set across the care economy, across the housing economy. If we take into account some of the large oligopolistic businesses across actually large chunks of the economy. Not saying they necessarily determine prices, but they're certainly very significant in constructing where prices are. So what the economy is has changed radically, but I don't think we've had much of a discussion about what we call value. And that, I think, is a question that is usefully provoked by AI. So, thinking through these questions of productivity and price, a while ago I was working with some social policy scholars who were thinking about this shift towards the care economy and thinking about what productivity means. Productivity is a really controversial question in things like early education and care and disability care. What on earth does productivity even mean in these contexts? But it's true that the Productivity Commission is the primary policy-making body for all of those sectors. That is how we determine policies, through the Productivity Commission. So the tools that we have for understanding this, and I think also the metaphors we have in our heads when we're thinking about AI, are based on a way of understanding the economy that is essentially about pin factories from Adam Smith, or if we update it a bit from Milton Friedman, maybe about pencils. And those two things have a bit in common. They're both manufactured goods. They're both a little bit complicated and hard to make. But they're also they're kind of all the same as each other, right? There's not a lot of differentiation. And a lot of our tools for understanding economic growth, prices, and productivity are all highly quantitative. They're all based on understanding quantities and changes in quantities, which is very well suited to exactly those kinds of things. So I think a lot of our thinking comes from that. So when I was asked to do this a little while ago, the Productivity Commission had just released some data showing that Australia had suffered very bad productivity numbers, and it dug into those, and it was talking about two examples where productivity had fallen particularly recently. This is a little while ago now. And the two examples it took out were bread and mines, mining and bread. So in bread, the number of bakers per loaf of bread has been increasing over the last couple of decades, because we've moved from mass-produced factory bread to artisanal bread that people go and pick up from their local shop when they get a coffee. Yeah. And the Productivity Commission reflected that maybe it wasn't really that sensible to think of that as a fall in productivity, because the kind of bread they were producing was radically different. And in fact, it wasn't just the bread that was being produced, it was a whole kind of society. It was a different way of social interaction, different way of building neighbourhoods and communities. And I think that is exactly what's been going on in what we call the economy and prices, but is not necessarily very well understood by the tools of economics. The other area was in mining, where the amount of capital and labour input per tonne of ore produced had been increasing as well. We'd be becoming less and less productive in our mining. Why was that? Because the price of ores had risen, and that meant we were mining harder and harder to mine ores, which were taking more and more resources per kilo per tonne to mine. That was associated with a fundamental economic challenge for Australia. This is going to make us poorer because we've got low productivity. And the thing that was making us poorer was literally the thing that was making us rich. The thing that was making us richest was the cause of the thing we thought was causing us to be poor. So something is going very wrong in the way we think about the debate about productivity. And I was having a discussion with someone else recently, and I have not looked at the data at this. I think the data doesn't exist, but if other people know, please correct me. One of the challenges we have in comparisons over time is the objective analysis has radically changed. We looked after old people in 1900. We raised children in 1900. None of that work is counted in any of the economic statistics in 1900. The rate of productivity growth that we record in 1900 is not the productivity growth of the equivalent entity we now call the economy. It's only the productivity growth of the monetary economy in 1900, which excludes large and the fastest growing elements of the workforce and of the economy now. And we know that there are lower productivity rates in the areas of the economy that are growing in the care economy than there are in the commodities economy. So what would happen if we looked at productivity rates of growth in the first half of the 20th century but we included all of the activities, all of the provisioning, all of the work that we now include when we measure the economy. What would happen to the productivity growth rates of those areas? Is it really true that productivity has actually collapsed? Or is it just that we've changed our definition of the thing we're measuring? And as we've changed that definition, so we've changed the composition of high productivity growth and low productivity growth sectors. In fact, this goes to the fact that we've kind of solved the economic problem as most economists of the people who actually founded the discipline of economics would understand it. Adam Smith and Ricardo, even Marx and Keynes would not consider half the things that we're talking about as the economy to be economic. They're not part of the economic question. The economic question is this question of the wealth of nations of producing physical stuff. And largely, at least in advanced countries like economies like Australia, those problems have largely been solved as economic problems. Now, we clearly haven't solved them as social problems, but I think this goes to why we might not be doing so well on those scores. And that leads us to, I think, to these solutions for that. And I'm not going to necessarily argue for either of these, but I wanted to talk about, I think, why there is a growing debate about them. And it goes precisely to that failure of that social question, that distributive question. And these are two different ways of doing that. So I think we've got the critique of the basic income idea, welfare for markets, which I think correctly identifies that basic income is a way of trying to solve that problem by integrating everything into monetary economies and then trying to level out incomes within monetary economies. Yeah. So we've got abundance. The reason that people can't access food is they don't have enough money to buy food. Let's just make sure everyone has enough money to buy food. Yeah. That's the simplest way of solving this problem, given where we are. Problem's not one of production. The problem's one of making sure everyone has enough money to be able to make this distributive system work properly. The alternative, fully automated luxury communism, which is based on universal services and shorter working hours, I think is somewhat closer to what Keynes might have envisaged, but is essentially taking everything out of the monetary economy. Its solution is to dissolve most of the monetary economy, to shrink it back into its box, and to allow all of these other questions to be determined other ways. Yeah. So our access to care services, even our access to housing, are not mediated by markets in the same way. We don't need the incomes in order to be able to buy those things. We don't need to work so much in order to be able to access them. In both cases, I think they go to the same question, which is, well, how do we make abundance a social reality? And I'm going to suggest that Australia has come up with a sort of weird way of working this through, which is to create this marketized model of the world, where I'm going to say we have delivered something in the end. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the socialist calculation debates of the early 1900s, but when we have the beginnings of general equilibrium economics, one of the left responses to that is to say, okay, it's true that general equilibrium is the most efficient way of distributing goods and services, but real markets are messy, they're oligopolistic, they're wasteful, they don't look like that. We'll eventually get something that looks like a computer, and we'll just be able to determine what the right prices are, and then governments can just set them. And it can be a centrally determined model of prices that still allow a monetary economy, and that is how we're going to achieve socialism. We're going to have the general equilibrium model, but it's not going to be run by markets. It's going to be run by states. And I think we've kind of got something that looks a little bit like that. Because across large swathes of the economy, the government is at least very important in influencing what prices are, if not in determining, not actually setting prices. I'm not suggesting it sets prices, but across the whole of the care economy, it certainly does. In the whole of education, it does. I think arguably in housing, it certainly heavily influences those things as well. If we add in Coles and Woolworths, then we've got a whole bunch of other administered prices. So we have a world where the ideas of neoclassical economics that are driving prices, but they're not driving prices because markets are competing those prices. They're driving prices because of competition policy. That is, governments are imposing sets of prices that they imagine look like the prices that competitive markets were they to exist, might produce in sectors they demonstrably never could exist in. It's an imagined world of prices that's been brought into existence through policymaking. Or as I call it, market socialism without the socialism. So that's the question of prices. And now on to investment, and then I'll shut up so that we can have a discussion. So again, I do stuff in a lot of different spaces. Actually, most of my work is around the fiscal logics, the way that governments calculate what they're doing and control the economy with their various tools. And so as a question of investment, AI is also an overwhelmingly dominant one. It's causing an enormous surge of investment, both in the stock market, so as a potential bubble, but also in real stuff. Yeah, we've got a massive expansion of data centers, massive expansion of energy resources, genuinely huge quantums of investment. So I spend a bunch of my time now in this other area of the economy, the climate economy, where one of the central premises of that debate is that there is just no way you could mobilize trillions of dollars that quickly to do a thing that we already know how to do and is central to the future of human existence. But we have managed to mobilize that amount of capital for something we don't know what it does, and most people think is probably slightly bad for human existence. Like, that is just spectacular. How on earth did that happen? So over here, we have the millions, from billions to trillions agenda, where we said, well, governments don't have any money, but maybe they could just scrape a little bit of money together, and then we could turn that money into multiples of it through mobilizing private investment by de-risking private capital. If anyone has followed this debate, you know that billions turned into millions, not into trillions. It's been a spectacular failure in basically not mobilizing any money at all. So that is just really weird, that we also have something about the way investment is mobilized now that doesn't in any way seem to respond to any sensible assessment of what economies are supposed to do or human need. So this is my reflection on what's driving the AI debate. And all of that, I think, is to suggest whatever's driving the AI debate is not actually trying to solve the problem of scarcity or trying to make sure there is material abundance for everyone. Those might be byproducts or not, but that certainly isn't, I don't think, what's actually the aim of all of that investment. That's not what it's trying to do. If it was really trying to do that, the climate economy would go gangbusters. And this is business versus household debt. Almost all of that household debt, people will know, is mortgage debt. It's wonderful to see that the surge of investment into housing in Australia has solved the problem of housing and has produced housing abundance, rather than maybe potentially having caused the problem of housing affordability. So something is driving lots of investment in housing, in AI. But across most of those categories, you can see that the proportion of profits that are realised as capital gains has been growing. The proportion of profits realised as ordinary profits on revenues has been declining. And profit models generally have been oriented towards these large capital gains, which is why there's, you see this surge in many of the companies even before they list, which is not associated with them getting revenues. It's all based on predicated on some future world where there's going to be heaps of revenues for them. Yeah, that's what Uber does, Netflix does, what most of the big tech firms do. That's business model they operate on. And when you think through what is that world that they're trying to do, where almost all of them are trying to become monopoly players, to dominate markets, have price setting ability, and to extract rents. Like, that's actually the business model. Now, it's also associated with innovation to get there, but that's the business model, is driving those, and that's what's partly going on in the Australian housing market as well. If you think about how housing investment is repaid, it's increasingly repaid through capital gains. In fact, that is the centre of the business models that are partly driving the investment. So that leads to a different scenario, not one of fully automated luxury communism, but the techno-feudalism that Yanis Varoufakis has been talking about. About, let's 7 or 8 years, Jim Stanford, who was here as the head of the Centre for Future Work, is I think now back in Canada, was looking at the resurgence of gig work and did this great paper, which he came out to Macquarie to present and then published. Looking at the resurgence of gig work around Uber and like Deliveroo and all of those sorts of things. And when he unpacks their business models, he says, look, there is a bit of new technology here, but you wouldn't say there's heaps of new technology. There is, like, Uber driving has a lot of very direct similarities to taxi driving in terms of, like, there's a person in a physical car that goes and picks you up and takes you somewhere. So there's an app that kind of somewhat automates and speeds up that matching process. But a lot of what most of these apps do is to either deliberately or inadvertently break the law. They break regulatory rules. So Uber did something that was illegal. You weren't allowed to pick up people off the street that you didn't know and get paid for it without a taxi license. Like, that was the law. And they just broke the law so much to such an extent that the government changed the law. Right? That's what happened. You think about what Airbnb does, it essentially breaks the law by hiring out a bunch of places which are now de facto hotels, but are not called hotels, so they don't pay hotel tax, they're not regulated by hotels, by councils. But we've kind of changed the rules so that they sort of are allowed to do that. So we have a model which is as much about reworking the social system as it is about economic innovation. In fact, a lot of these business models are primarily not about changing the way we produce things, they're about changing the rules of distribution in ways that allow capital gains to be realized by giving those companies extra rights in the future to claim rents. So I think that suggests it's not necessarily technological innovation in the strict sense, but business model innovation that's going on here, social regulation, why there's such an aggressive push around intellectual property rules and law, as much as it is about productivity gains in any normal sense. To the extent that it is about productivity gains, the main things that AI does, which are around social connection, how we engage with each other and talk to each other, almost everybody thinks they do badly at now. We've got the government regulating to ban young people from being able to engage with these technologies because they think they are so harmful. Partly because they're not designed to do social connection and well-being. That's not their goal, even though that is demonstrably the goal of those areas of human activity that we now have incorporated into markets. In fact, we haven't got rid of money through this process. We've radically expanded the areas of social life that are governed by money, pushing money into a whole bunch of places that were never originally thought of as the economy. So they are now governed by money, which is now why I think partly we have a government that governs via prices, because that's how you govern, and these things need to be governed. But they're not fundamentally really economic questions in the traditional sense. And that, I think, does depressingly lead in the extreme to techno-feudalism, the argument Varoufakis makes, that it is by capturing those platform economies as private property and then extracting rents around them that we are shifting back to a more feudal model. I think that's actually explicitly what Peter Thiel says they're trying to do in the kind of world of supermen. But I don't think that's at all inevitable. But I do think that is a large chunk of what we're seeing. And that is not AI being disruptive technologically. That's it following the current model we have of how businesses work. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Well, that was fabulous. We've got, and you've achieved also something very rare, which is to have lots of time for questions. So congratulations on that. Yet you still gave such a lot of content from there. I'm going to start off just because I've got a burning question to say, what's new here? You know, when Tommy Bahama produces clothing, they're not trying to do it thinking about what's going to improve my social welfare and the way I dress clothing or something like that. They're thinking about their profits.
Yep.
Isn't that the same?
Yep.
When Uber comes in and says, well, you know what, our taxi system is really screwed up. We shouldn't have those regulations. We can design a system that's incredibly popular and undoubtedly what the consumers want. Let's destroy the laws in order to be able to do it. What's new here of saying that private companies, be they AI, are looking after themselves and getting on and trying to get us to want to buy their products and be attracted towards that. So that's my first thing, and then I'll open up to everyone else.
Yeah, so I think that's true. Although I think those two examples are very different. So I think there's one thing which is we're going to change the way we play within the existing rules of the game to be more efficient, which I think is what mainstream economic theory says markets do and why they're welfare maximizing. And the way we are going to gain more profits is by breaking the rules in ways that are not, and sure, I didn't agree with the taxi system either, but which are very obviously not democratic. That is, they don't go through elections. They don't go through our formal system of democracy. We might say there are bad things about the formal system of democracy, and rent seekers go there too, completely. But I think those two things are quite different. And one of the things that I think is interesting about AI for me is that the entire conversation presumes we're talking about the first one. That is, we're innovating the way that we play within the existing rules of the game, and we're speeding up production and reducing the number of resources to go into things. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests actually the main thing that's going on is the latter. That is, we're changing the rules of the game. And especially around AI, I think we are much less confident that those companies are trying to break rules in ways that are welfare enhancing for most people.
Yet to be seen, I suppose.
Yeah, yet to be seen, I agree.
Other questions, please.
What about leisure? Because there's all these people that aren't going to be working, and then you've got the baby boomers. Every second person seems to be on a cruise, traveling, and then they get to the next thing where they need someone to look after them. But also you've got this younger group where they're gamers. Like who would have thought somebody would have a job being a gamer? So I think, do you think we're going to have these two groups of leisure products or economies?
There clearly is a shift towards leisure economies as incomes rise. Partly that shows that money is just, the spaces of money are expanding dramatically because they're all monetized spaces of leisure, right? There are lots of forms of leisure. You can walk outside and sit in the botanical gardens that don't involve any money. So I think we are seeing an expansion of the spaces that are governed by prices. That is happening. That's one of the main things I'm arguing is that's happening everywhere. That is not associated with the tools that we use as economists to understand the economy. I don't think. I think they're increasingly decoupled. And that's one of the real challenges in policy making is it's interesting to me that you could have a debate about early education and care where the primary thing wasn't how we socialise young people. Like Productivity Commission barely even mentions that you'd socialise young people.
And
isn't that the primary purpose?
Train and
Like, how does that work? Yeah. So I think that means that what we're actually doing is we're producing forms of society. So we're determining what kind of social world we have, what neighborhoods we have, what relationships we have. But we're doing that as if that's a technical question of productivity and prices. Like that's how we think about it, as a technical issue of pricing, which I think is very odd as a way of trying to govern those aspects of life. Yeah.
Quick question. One of your first slides you showed with the shifts of the labour market, and I loved how you talked about the measuring piece because I had a discussion with someone in the health space about like autism and autism rates have gone up, but it's actually we're measuring more, and I thought the way you articulated that was really interesting. With the Australian context of the services share and how that's gone up, you put in the context of some of the other OECD countries as well, and Australia's quite a lot larger. Two questions. One, have you looked at how it looks on a global scale? This articulation of Australia versus global. Are we just seeing shifts in where things are happening, or is it, maybe gut feel would be my first question, right? And then the second one would be that Australian context compared to other OECD countries. Do you think that has a lot to do with the way that government is playing in the pricing space? US is quite different from Australia in its healthcare. Does that have an implication for we've just monetized more of it than maybe other countries have, and so we're picking up more in the market?
Yeah, so I think it probably is. This also coincides with the NDIS expansion, with expansions in Medicare as well that have taken place. There certainly is an export-import phenomenon around education and higher education. You could probably see that as a displacement effect. My gut instinct is that's not most of it. That like the proportion of exports and imports in the care economy and welfare state is still pretty low, like they're outside of higher education. So I don't think that's most of it. I do think that what we are seeing though is an expansion of access to social reproduction, you might say, which is primarily not done as fully automated luxury communism, but by the expansion of the price system, a price system that is overwhelmingly structured by government. So that a large proportion of demand is by government, the way services are delivered are regulated by government, and even the pricing in some contexts is as well. But that all shows up much more inside the privatised space. So therefore, it probably is partly a measurement issue. I think in the US, there's a labour versus value issue because the health is actually a much larger proportion of GDP in the US, but that's also because profits are a much larger share, like in the health space. Profits are quite low in most parts of the OECD in those spaces because they're largely socialised.
Does that cover, the US context, does health there cover the manufacturing side of health, or is it just the healthcare bit?
I think it does cover pharmaceuticals. Now, whether you say that that's a manufacturing space, the proportion of value in pharmaceuticals that comes from manufacturing is tiny, right? Like the pills themselves don't cost very much to make. So almost all of it is IP. And so then you go into a debate about, well, what is IP representing? And we're having a trade dispute with Trump about that at the moment, where it's very obvious that the amount that IP commands is very directly influenced by government regulation in a way that like triples its value or quadruples its value or not. So this relationship between price and value, really hard to, like, how do you not just say they're government administered prices? And in the US, the government administers them to be really high.
I'm not quite sure how to articulate this. It kind of went on from what Em was saying, but I guess from a government policy perspective, whether the rules are changing or we're monetizing more, which is super interesting, the fundamental problem that we have about sort of paying for our living standards over the long run and therefore searching everywhere we can for some sort of productivity boost with nothing else really on the horizon except for AI, relative to everything you've said. I guess what they're sitting there, worthwhile investment in data centers and not necessarily in AI training, but perhaps in internet as a service and other applications. Given this, like, from your perspective, do you think that that is a worthwhile investment, or do you think that, I guess, more embracing more of a socialist framework and just abandoning this idea of market mechanisms, which seems to be sort of implied a little bit? They're trying to boost productivity through market, I guess. The suggestion here is that we're already kind of not doing that, so why not embrace? Sorry, said I couldn't articulate it very well.
No, I think I'm getting where you're coming from. So I certainly think that the idea that increasing productivity is a primary way to solve problems for government misunderstands the question. That if that were true, the problem would be solved. The things demonstrably happen in some areas of the economy, like food, like in just a really obvious, straightforward way. So something else is going on. A large chunk of that is that the proportion of things in the monetized economy that are things we think private firms do well has been shrinking. And the proportion of the monetized economy of things that we would normally expect to be organized in some other way has been growing. But we have had a firm political commitment to hold public spending stable as a proportion of GDP, which creates a permanent fiscal crisis. That's what creates a permanent fiscal crisis. We're expanding the monetization of a whole bunch of things that governments would, or communities or families would be done outside of markets. We've incorporated those into markets, and then we've held the proportion that the public's allowed to do stable. That's obviously a recipe for disaster, in my view.
But it hasn't. It's gone up by 3 percentage points in the last 3 years or 4 years or something.
Which is
3% of GDP.
That's responding to exactly that tension, right? But there's been a big pressure not to, right? So It's true that this Labor government has relaxed that a bit, and I think has now got to the point, and I think there might be people from Treasury here who will know better than I do. There is increasing acceptance that the tax to GDP ratio is actually just too low. Because when you try to solve those problems, there's no other way out of it. But I think there are two bits that kind of have been happening, even more so than that. So one is we've reconstructed the public's ability to determine economic outcomes in ways that do not equate to the amount of public spending. So having user payments, which are very obviously de facto taxes, having means testing, also a de facto tax, having off-balance sheet investment mechanisms, also extremely popular. All of those are ways of dealing with that problem by redefining the public's control of economic outcomes as not what is measured by the measure of public spending, so that you can balance those two entities off. To be honest, I think the main challenge is that we don't talk about what the social outcome is we want. Now, whether that's socialism or capitalism, whatever, we don't say this is the kind of society we would like. How do we go about building that society? We talk about them as if they're technical economic questions of productivity, which they just demonstrably aren't.
Sorry, I 100% agree,
Yeah.
but I don't think economists do that well. Like, I don't see that as our job, because we optimize within whatever objective we're sort of given, I think. And isn't that theoretically, not saying it's real,
Yeah.
the objective of politics or government or the people's voice?
Yeah, but I think so. But you optimize. But I mean, welfare economics has a good, like, it's normative, right? Like, you can say that something's better than something else. It just pretends it isn't. Like, welfare economics, like, it's in the name. Welfare economics is normative. It just doesn't talk about what its normative goals are. It treats it
That's
as
my
if it's,
point. We're not good at we don't set goals necessarily.
you operationalize policy as if you had.
Yeah.
Because so maybe there needs to be someone who's talking about what the goals are somewhere. I agree that maybe that's interdisciplinary. It's not just I'm not saying it's economists' fault. I'm more going, the kind of problem that we're trying to solve is not the kind of problem that is well suited to those tools. But we've expanded the role of central financial departments, not contracted.
I think what you're saying and why it is the economist's problem is that the one thing you haven't said, but I think you meant it, our preferences have shifted more towards having more of these non-market things, childcare, aged care, welfare payments, NDIS, and so forth. But we know that they don't get delivered well by private sector in a price-based sector, and yet that's what economists are about. We're supposed to be delivering, maximum utility within the resource constraints. So it does become our problem, and I think that's the point that Ben's highlighting, that our preferences over time have shifted more towards this stuff that's non-marketable. Governments are doing a crummy job trying to deliver it, but doing the best they can because it's non-market. And how the hell do we solve this issue?
Our preferences are also, it's not just that the preferences have shifted those things, we've changed our preferences over how we want them delivered.
Yeah.
We did raise children and look after old people in 1900, right? Like, it's not like those things are new, but we have had a revolution of gender norms, which I fully support, but which has meant that we do not think it is appropriate to impose very strong gender relations and have all women in homes in unpaid labour. So we've moved those things into public spaces, we've done that, the way we've done that, and there were many ways we could do that, we've done that by monetizing, which moves them into the public sphere. So I don't think it's a shift in preferences, it's a reorganization of sectors of society to redefine things which were not called the economy into things called the economy.
There was a question up there.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to the question of AI and labor and how it will impact labor. And from what I understand, and I'm just a hobbyist, so mostly dumb things. So what you said is that looking back historically, any automation technological advancement actually has not necessarily led to a reduction of labor. But for example, working hours kept steady historically. and labor now is more in the service industry than in the production industry. And so taking that as your hypothesis, your prediction would be that production industry will further be automated, and the care industry, which is labor intensive, whatever, it's not just hospitality or etc. I suspect you also like corporate design jobs, product design jobs, etc. That will continue growing. Is that your hypothesis?
Sort of. So that relationship is only really true from the 70s. So if you go back before the 1970s, automation leads to a reduction in working hours.
Yeah.
And it does for like 150 years before that.
Yeah.
So something changes around then that doesn't lead to that relationship working. I think there are two possible and I think plausible and convincing hypotheses which are different, and maybe they both did, who knows. So one is about a shift in power from labour to capital, which makes it harder for workers to translate productivity gains into leisure, which is one of the things that's happening by unions for the period before. And the other is this redefinition of what we call work, which is largely by feminist movements, to make visible work which was work and was just not even wasn't visible at all in this question, to make it visible, and that offsets some of the reductions in work in the areas that we did count and were visible.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two things are happening at the same time, right?
Yep.
So I think both of those things are happening. I do think that the amount of labour in physical production is likely to continue to decline. That whether it's AI or just other forms of automation, that's a very clear trend. The other trends about total work, I think they are social, not economic questions. Like both the things I've mentioned, the balance of power between capital and labour, and essentially the balance of power between men and women, are not really economic questions. But they're central to the main economic outcome that we're looking at. And that's why I think the tools are not very well designed for the problem we're looking at, because these are about how do we organise what everyone does. And a lot of what we're doing is not typically what we call the economy.
So therefore your prediction for labour in the future, how does labour look like in the future then?
I think that is a live question of like political organisation and contestation.
I just want to make sure that Richard gets a chance to come here before we close. So
yeah, in obsessing about productivity, I mean, you referred to this, we're focused on quantity. And the statisticians use this language, they talk about volumes. But when it comes to most of the things we consume, services, it's the quality dimension that we care about. Yep. It's impossible to buy anything without getting asked afterwards, what you thought about the quality of the service.
Yep.
When my parents were in an aged care facility, the higher the staffing ratios, the better, because the better the quality of the service. And that's what we cared about.
Yep.
So as a profession, as economists, aren't we just kind of missing the point completely and obsessing about productivity and quantities?
Yeah, I think it's the wrong measure. Like, I think we should be, that doesn't mean that economics doesn't have a role and we aren't trying to do something, but I agree, like most of the things that we care about are not very well measured by the measure of productivity. It's kind of meaningless. So it also is odd that at the moment, like now, that the Productivity Commission is the main economic body, the main way we do things, when most of its brief seems to be doing things that most people don't think are productivity.
And both the Productivity Commission and the Australian Bureau of Statistics like to tell us that productivity is going down in non-market services.
Yeah.
because they've got numbers that say that.
Yeah.
And it's nonsense.
Well, I mean, how do you even compare it to the care that was being offered in 1900? Like, it's like.
They just put a good footnote on it.
Yes, question in the back.
Question I have one. So there's a lot of people in casual employment, partial employment, partly unemployment, and I've read that the ABS has the way they define and measure employment as that metric has not changed for the last 30 years. And so they significantly underestimate the actual level of partial unemployment. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I think they do now they've got an additional measure about underemployment.
Yes.
So it's true. I think the base unemployment figure is still, all of these things are kind of made up by, in a good way. I don't there's no other way to do them. They don't come from the sky. All the concepts we use are made up by economists to try and grapple with the world we're living in, right? And most of the concepts we have at the moment were designed by Keynesians to be able to manage macroeconomic shocks, right? So they are as was all the cash accounting of government books. Why it looks so different from the private sector was its primary job was not to be able to track net worth or profits. Its primary job was to be able to work out whether it was expansionary or contractionary. So you wanted to track flows of money across boundaries in real time, right? That was the purpose of it. And I think the purposes of many of the things we're trying to do have shifted, but we are still using the same concepts and therefore the same categories. And that is causing a disconnect in our ability to get the outcomes we want because the categories just don't fit onto the things we're looking at anymore properly. Yeah.
I've got an interesting question from online here by Edward. Basically saying that if AI is taking over more of the professional space and so forth, leading more people into inherently unskilled labor, he doesn't quite put it that way. Does this mean that we're going to be quote unquote reforming the minimum wage laws as people scramble and obviously have to start accepting lower wages than whatever? It's a bit like the Uber thing, but in a different sort of context.
Yeah.
Australia's minimum wage law.
Yeah, no, so completely. So, and I agree that there is some evidence that the sorts of jobs that are hit harder in professional services, so there's accounting and KPMG and so forth might be experiencing a lot of it, particularly entry-level jobs in those areas. I agree with that. I think, so exactly what happens, I think, is quite hard to predict. There'll be a whole bunch of new jobs, obviously, that are created, and those jobs will probably use skills that AI doesn't use, and that will probably be reasonably high-skilled jobs. It's hard to predict exactly where they are, but one would imagine that's what's happened every other time this has gone on with automation. So I'm not entirely pessimistic about that. I think we are also, though, seeing a redefinition of what skill is across the economy. And that, most of the equal wage cases are largely about the fact that our skill categories that have emerged through the award era are all determined by blue-collar, male-dominated work. And they don't apply actually very well to most of the industries that are expanding. So I also think we will, in retrospect, look back and think that many of the jobs that we currently don't pay very much are high skilled, and they will be higher paid in the future.
I'm going to have the last question just here that you've been waiting on, and then we'll close the session.
Thank you. So I think you're saying that, we all know markets are a pretty good way of organising productive activity and in the non-market service. And the question for us as economists is, how do you regulate? And that's the challenge in lots of these non-market sectors. But I think the question from your presentation, the ending up is, how should you regulate? What does what you're saying say for how we should regulate AI in order to achieve the outcomes that you're saying that we need to get to? How should we regulate this new activity?
I think taking one step back to the first bit of the summary was many of the things that we are trying to regulate, I don't think the tools of economics by themselves are the best way of trying to regulate. We need to ask the question of what is it that we want them to do? Like, what do we think early education and care should look like? What do we think higher education should look like? What should the transport system, density of cities, like those are social questions. They should legitimately debate as social questions. And then economists can try to maximize those ends. But we need to have an explicit debate about what the ends are, because the implicit ends in the economic model, I do not think equate to most ordinary people's understanding of what they want those things to do. So, and that's not neutral. That is reconstructing them in ways that many people would prefer they were not reconstructed as. They make them worse. Normatively, they make them worse for people. And I think it's the same with AI. Like we need to have a clear idea of what we wanted to do rather than leaving that question to Elon Musk. And then when things go wrong, going, maybe we should try and regulate it. Look, I actually do think we need to have a more, that sort of normative element of policymaking needs to be more explicit. And one of the challenges I think we've had, especially in Australia, more so than most countries, is in being relatively afraid of that politics, we've used economics as a way of making it more technocratic and taking it out of the realm of politics. So it's not a political question, it's just a technical question of how to, and that has some advantages for it, at least in the short run. But I think in the long run, it has some serious challenges because many people no longer see themselves in the way that policy is designed. Is that, yeah?
I think
Whether I know you disagree with me, but you understand me. That's enough.
I think that fundamental point of, you know, if you want to get a good path to go into the future, you've got to know where you want to land. And we don't think I don't think anyone would believe that we think enough about what we ultimately want our economy to look like. And then how do we actually move towards it? It all seems so incremental on how we want the process to go. And there, it's also a nice place to end this discussion as well. So thank you very much indeed, Ben.
Thank you.
Can I just use the last minute or so also to remind everyone that we have our final event of the year coming up, which is the fabulous Nobel Prize night. We're not going to actually award a Nobel Prize, but we are going to talk about this year's Nobel Prize. We've got Hugh Harley and Petra Selecic speaking on the prize. It's always a fun night. It's in person only, and it's the Art House Hotel with a social afterwards for the end of year function. That's on the 3rd of December in the evening. So please do come along for that. Thank you to the audience online. Thank you very much to Ben, and we'll hopefully see you all on the 3rd of December. Thank you very much.
In your diaries.
It's in my diary.
It is in your diary, right?